At some point, I am going to make a video explaining more about what happens in Syria and what the current situation is, because there's a lot of disinformation out there, both from alternative media and the mainstream media, because nobody seems to give a shit about what the reality is. But this is specifically in response to people like Kyle Kulinski, who perpetuate two main lies. The first is that Pentagon and CIA-backed rebels fight each other, that the U.S. has such an incoherent strategy in Syria that they actually back sides that are opposed to each other. This is only theoretically true because, well, certain rebel groups may or may not approve of Kurdish separatism. The fact is that only one battle actually ever occurred between the Kurds and CIA-backed rebels, and that doesn't count because the Kurds in question were not backed by the Pentagon, and that's because the Kurds in question were from Afrin, and Afrin was isolated from the rest of Kurdish territory, and therefore the Pentagon couldn't support them, nor could the other Kurds for that matter. Not the least because it would also piss off the Turks if they actually did. So that fight doesn't really count. The other lie is that the primary purpose of the U.S. being in Syria is to overthrow Assad. If the primary purpose of the U.S. being in Syria was to overthrow Assad, they would have done it already, because they certainly have the capability, and they've had years and many excuses to use in order to do it, but they never have. No. The reason that U.S. forces are in Syria is, despite what the Russians want you to think, and what the isolationists want you to think to justify leaving, is, or rather I should say was, since they no longer exist, to destroy the Islamic State. That is why they were there. U.S. forces only entered Syria because the Islamic State was in Syria, and the U.S. was already fighting them in Iraq. And it didn't make a lot of sense to stop fighting them just because they went over the Syria-Iraq border. That's why they're there. Now, because of that, they've inevitably gotten themselves mixed up in Syria's civil war. There's no way to avoid it. But it is nevertheless a fact that the reason the U.S. military is in Syria was to fight ISIS, and now is sort of undefined, but practically speaking is to protect the independence of Rojava. It is not to depose Assad.